Have you ever felt like life pulled the rug out from under you, leaving you standing in the ruins of everything you once worked for? John Parker knows that feeling all too well. After dedicating 25 years to climbing the corporate ladder, he thought he had secured his future, only to have it all ripped away in an instant. John Parker was in his late 40s, a man who had built his entire identity around his work. His life in the corporate world was like a meticulously constructed house of cards, one he never expected to collapse so abruptly. 25 years of dedication, countless hours spent behind a desk, late nights sacrificed for meetings, and a relentless drive to climb higher in a company that had seemed like his forever home. Then, just like that, the email arrived. "We regret to inform you." The words blurred together, each sentence stripping away more of his sense of security and worth. His position had been eliminated. It wasn't personal, they said, just business. But to John, it felt deeply personal, like a rejection of everything he had become. The sudden loss of his career left him spiraling, questioning what he had been working for all these years. Sitting in his high-rise apartment, John stared blankly at the city skyline. He used to love this view, the bustling energy, the constant movement of the market. Now it seemed empty, as if the vibrance had drained away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The money he'd saved over the years would keep him afloat for a while, but that didn't bring much comfort. With no job prospects on the horizon, and a mind cluttered with thoughts of his future, he knew he needed a change. He started thinking about the place he'd once called home, a small town he hadn't visited in years. His childhood house, long sold, and the simple, slower pace he once found suffocating, now called to him like a sanctuary. He packed his belongings with a heavy heart and a sense of loss, leaving behind the apartment he'd proudly called his own for over a decade. The drive back was surreal. Each mile seemed to peel away the layers of his corporate persona, revealing the man he used to be. John, the dreamer. John, the optimist who believed in possibilities beyond the paycheck. He took back roads through fields and small towns, passing landmarks that triggered memories of a younger self, full of ambition and hope. The smell of pine trees through his open window felt nostalgic, almost therapeutic, bringing a flood of emotion. As he reached his old hometown, the familiar sight of the diner, the movie theater, and the small park where he and Mark used to play ball made him pause. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside, a strange mixture of sadness and hope. The diner hadn't changed much. Its faded sign still read, "Molly's Place," a name that always brought a smile to his face because it had belonged to Mark's mom, who'd served the best pie in town. He remembered sneaking in after hours to steal leftover slices, laughing until their stomachs hurt. Now, as he pushed the door open, the bell above jingling softly, he felt a wave of nervousness. What if Mark wasn't here? What if he didn't recognize him? But then, there he was, Mark, standing behind the counter, wiping down tables. He looked different, of course. A few more wrinkles around his eyes, a bit more gray in his hair, but the same easy smile. "John, is that really you?" Mark's voice boomed across the empty diner. The initial awkwardness hung between them like a fog, neither quite sure what to say. They exchanged pleasantries, each trying to make sense of the paths their lives had taken. John felt a pang of regret for letting so many years pass without reaching out. "I didn't think I'd see you back here," Mark said, handing John a cup of coffee, the same way he always had, back when they were just kids dreaming of leaving town. "I didn't think I'd be back," John admitted quietly, staring down at the steaming cup. The warmth seeped into his hands, bringing an unexpected sense of comfort. There was a pause before Mark leaned forward, a curious look on his face. "So, what brings you back?" John hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "How do you explain that you've lost everything without sounding like a failure?" But with Mark, there was no point in pretending. "I got laid off," he said finally, each word feeling heavy and raw. Mark's expression softened. "Man, I'm sorry to hear that." And in those simple words, John felt something he hadn't in a long time. Understood. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Then, Mark began sharing his own struggles. The diner, once a community hub, was now barely breaking even. Customers had dwindled, and he had been doing everything himself just to keep it afloat. "Guess we're both trying to figure out what's next," Mark said with a wry smile, but there was no bitterness in his voice, just an acceptance of life's unpredictability. As the evening wore on, Their conversation deepened. They talked about the lost years, about dreams that never came true, and the pain of watching life take unexpected turns. John realized he wasn't alone in his suffering. Mark had his own share of heartbreaks and setbacks. There was a strange sense of camaraderie in their shared disappointments, a bond that seemed to grow stronger with every story exchanged. The clock ticked past closing time, but neither of them made a move to leave. They were caught up in a rare moment of reconnection, like finding a long-lost treasure. For the first time since he'd left the city, John felt a glimmer of something he couldn't quite put into words, a small, fragile sense of possibility. When Mark finally stood to lock up, John glanced around the empty diner, its worn-out booths and faded wallpaper, speaking of better days gone by. This place used to be packed, John mused, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Mark chuckled softly. Yeah, well, things change. But something in John's mind had shifted. He saw more than just an empty diner. He saw potential. What if they could breathe life back into it? What if they could create something new together? He glanced at Mark, who was busy stacking chairs, oblivious to the thoughts racing through John's mind. Hey, what if we tried something different? He started, unsure how to put his wild idea into words. Mark raised an eyebrow. Different? How? And that was how the seed was planted, an unformed idea that would soon take on a life of its own. Forget the diner, John said suddenly, excitement creeping into his voice. What if we took this on the road? Mark stared at him, bewildered. You mean like a food truck? John shrugged, smiling for the first time in days. Why not? We've got the skills, the recipes, and nothing left to lose. There was a long pause. Then Mark's face broke into a slow grin. You know, that's the craziest thing I've heard in a long time. But the look in his eyes was unmistakable. Hope. The next morning, John showed up at the diner bright and early, a notebook full of scribbled plans in hand. Mark greeted him with a mix of amusement and curiosity, wiping his hands on his apron as he eyed the notebook. You're serious about this? He asked, raising an eyebrow. John nodded, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in months. They sat down at one of the corner booths, the smell of freshly brewed coffee enveloping them, and began to brainstorm in earnest. John talked logistics, permits, routes, costs, while Mark interjected with bursts of creative energy, listing off recipe ideas and menu items that would set them apart. The conversation flowed effortlessly, their excitement building as they bounced ideas back and forth. It was like they were kids again, scheming late into the night about their dreams of making it big. But enthusiasm was only the first step. Reality hit hard as they started crunching the numbers. Neither had the kind of wealth or savings to buy a new food truck, let alone deck it out with the equipment they'd need. They both went quiet, staring at the numbers on the page like it was some insurmountable wall. We're going to need a miracle, John murmured, but Mark shook his head, a determined glint in his eye. We don't need a miracle, just a little luck, and maybe some help. That's when Mark remembered an old friend who had an unused delivery truck sitting in his garage, rusting away. After a few phone calls and a lot of persuasion, they managed to secure the vehicle for a fraction of what it would have cost to buy new. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. With their makeshift food truck parked outside the diner, they got to work. The days blurred together in a frenzy of repairs and refurbishments, each task more daunting than the last. John, who had never so much as changed a tire, found himself elbow-deep in grease, his hands stained and blistered. But every time he felt overwhelmed, he looked over at Mark, who was working just as tirelessly, and something inside pushed him to keep going. They sanded down the rust, replaced old parts, and painted the entire truck a vibrant shade of red. Mark's idea, to symbolize renewal. It wasn't a fancy piece of machinery, but by the time they were done, it looked like a symbol of hope, a testament to their hard work and resilience. Naming it felt like christening a ship before its maiden voyage. After hours of tossing around suggestions, they landed on second chances. It was perfect, a nod to their own lives, their friendship, and the journey they were embarking on together. They even designed a logo, two hands clasped together, surrounded by a circle of stars. As they stepped back to admire their creation, a swell of pride filled John's chest. What do you think? He asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Mark stood beside him, hands on his hips, a grin spreading across his face. I think we might just pull this off. With the truck finally road-ready, they turned their attention to the menu. Mark's culinary talents came alive as he whipped up dishes that married the comforts of home-cooked meals with a gourmet twist. There was the Mark's Melt, a gooey grilled cheese sandwich with 3 types of cheese and caramelized onions, and John's Comeback Burger, a towering creation stacked with layers of flavor. But what they were most proud of was their signature dish, Second Chance Sliders, mini burgers infused with a smoky, tangy sauce that left customers wanting more. Each item on the menu felt like a piece of their story, a blend of hardship, creativity, and a dash of boldness. Their first day out was nerve-wracking. They'd decided to set up in the bustling downtown area, hoping to catch the lunch crowd. John felt his stomach tighten as they pulled into a vacant spot, the truck's bright red paint catching the sunlight. Mark glanced over, sensing his anxiety. "You nervous?" he asked with a teasing smile. John exhaled slowly, nodding. "A little." "Okay, a lot." Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't worry. We'll either make a killing or crash and burn. Either way, it'll be one heck of a ride." John couldn't help but laugh. That was Mark for you, always finding the humor, even in the most tense situations. They opened up the serving window, the kitchen inside the truck, cramped but buzzing with energy. For the first hour, business was slow. A few curious passers-by stopped to look, but no one ordered. John felt his nerves unraveling with every passing minute. "What if this was a mistake?" he muttered under his breath. But then a young couple wandered over, glancing at the menu. "What's good?" the guy asked, and without missing a beat, Mark launched into his pitch, his passion for food shining through. They ordered a couple of sliders, and after the first bite, the woman's eyes lit up. "Oh my God! This is amazing," she exclaimed, her excitement contagious. Word spread slowly at first. One customer turned into 2, then 4, then 10. By mid-afternoon, they had a small line forming. John could barely keep up, his hands moving frantically as he took orders, made change, and tried to keep track of the mounting receipts. Mark was a whirlwind of activity beside him, flipping burgers, toasting buns, and tossing fries with practiced ease. There were moments of chaos when everything seemed on the verge of falling apart, but somehow they managed. When they finally closed up for the day, exhausted but exhilarated, John looked at Mark, panting slightly. "We did it," he breathed, disbelief coloring his voice. "We actually did it." But the journey was just beginning. Their initial success brought a rush of hope, but also new challenges. The truck, already an aging beast, started showing signs of strain under the constant use. One day, it refused to start, leaving them stranded for hours. Another time, a freak rainstorm soaked their entire setup, ruining a batch of supplies. Each setback felt like a blow, chipping away at their resolve. John found himself falling into old patterns, obsessing over profit margins and cost efficiency, pushing them harder and harder to make up for lost days. Mark, on the other hand, stayed focused on the food, tweaking recipes, experimenting with new flavors, keeping his eye on the creative side. Their differences started to show. Mark accused John of turning their passion project into just another rat race. John, in turn, felt frustrated by what he saw as Mark's lack of urgency. "We have to be smart about this," he argued one evening, poring over their budget. "We can't afford to waste time." Mark shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "We can't afford to lose ourselves either." The tension simmered, neither willing to back down. But despite the friction, there was no denying that something special was happening. Customers kept coming, drawn not just by the food, but by the story behind it. The tale of 2 old friends, down on their luck, finding a way to start over. They caught the attention of a local food blogger who stumbled upon them one evening. He watched them work, listening to their banter, and ended up ordering half the menu. The next morning, his review went live. Second Chances isn't just a food truck, it's a comeback story on wheels. The article spread like wildfire, and by noon, their social media accounts were flooded with messages, shares, and an outpouring of support. John stared at his phone, disbelief etched on his face. "We're trending," he murmured, showing Mark the screen. Mark blinked, then broke into a grin. "Guess we're in the market now, huh?" And just like that, Second Chances was no longer a small-town experiment. It was becoming something bigger, a beacon of hope, drawing people from all over. "Ready for the next step?" Mark asked one evening, a spark of excitement in his eyes. John hesitated, the weight of their recent success heavy on his shoulders. Ready as I'll ever be. But even as they toasted to their victory, the cracks in their partnership began to widen. The surge in popularity was exhilarating. Every day brought new opportunities, from catering events to invitations to local food festivals. John and Mark found themselves swept up in a whirlwind of excitement, juggling orders and managing the increasing demand. But with success came complications. As second chances gained traction, John's ambitious side resurfaced and he began pushing for expansion. Talks of franchising, hiring more staff, and taking on bigger markets. It felt like the old days, where the thrill of the chase drove him, where every decision was about growth and profit. Mark, however, saw things differently. For him, this venture wasn't about building an empire. It was about reclaiming joy and doing something meaningful. The growing divide between their visions set the stage for conflict that neither could ignore. One evening, after a particularly busy day at a local festival, they sat in the back of the truck, exhaustion etched into their faces. "We need to strike while the iron's hot," John insisted, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of someone who'd tasted victory and wanted more. "We could get a second truck, hire a team, maybe even open a small restaurant." Mark stared at him, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "Are you out of your mind?" he asked slowly. "We barely have time to keep up with this one. Why can't you just enjoy what we have?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. John leaned forward, frustration bubbling up. "Because if we don't grow, we'll get left behind. I've seen it happen 100 times, Mark. We have a chance here. Why are you so afraid to take it?" Mark's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm not afraid. I just don't want to lose what makes this special, what makes us special." The argument spiraled from there. Every pent-up frustration, every unspoken resentment came pouring out. Mark accused John of turning their dream into another corporate venture, stripping away the soul of what they'd built. "This isn't about money for me," he shouted, his face flushed with emotion. "It's about creating something real, something we can be proud of." John fired back, his voice sharp with anger. "You think I don't want that too? But pride doesn't pay the bills, Mark. We have a shot at something bigger. Why are you so determined to hold us back?" The words cut deep, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Two friends on opposite sides of a chasm they couldn't seem to bridge. Their shouting drew the attention of festival-goers nearby, the heated exchange echoing across the emptying lot. Embarrassed, Mark turned away, his shoulders stiff. "You know what? Fine. If you want to run this like another one of your corporate projects, do it without me." John's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" But he already knew. Mark pulled off his apron and tossed it onto the counter, the gesture final. "I'm done, John. I didn't sign up for this." And just like that, he walked away, leaving John standing alone in the cramped kitchen, the hum of the festival fading around him. The fallout was immediate. The next few days were a blur of chaos as John scrambled to keep the truck running without Mark. Orders got mixed up, the quality slipped, and customers started to notice. One bad review led to another, and soon their once glowing reputation began to tarnish. John threw himself into work, trying to hold everything together, but it was like grasping at sand. Every effort seemed to crumble in his hands. He stayed up late at night, staring at the books, willing the numbers to make sense, but nothing added up without Mark's steadying presence. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from potential investors, eager to capitalize on their story, but without Mark, it all felt hollow. One afternoon, as he stood in the empty lot where they used to set up, staring at the truck that had once been a symbol of hope, he felt the full weight of his choices bearing down on him. The bright red paint that had once seemed so vibrant now looked garish in the harsh sunlight, a mocking reminder of his own hubris. A couple of kids walked by, pointing at the truck. "Isn't that the famous food truck?" one asked. The other shrugged. "Used to be, I guess." The casual dismissal stung more than John cared to admit. He realized then that he had become everything he'd promised himself he wouldn't, another businessman chasing success at the expense of what truly mattered. Determined to salvage what he could, John tried reaching out to Mark, but his calls went unanswered. Days turned into weeks, and the gulf between them only widened. Alone in the truck one evening, staring at the empty streets, John thought back to why they'd started this journey in the first place. It wasn't for the money, the fame, or the recognition. It was for a second chance, at friendship, at fulfillment, at finding joy in the simple act of creating something together. He had lost sight of that, blinded by the same ambitions that had driven him to burnout in his corporate life. The turning point came in the form of a small, handwritten note slipped under the windshield wiper one morning. "Come to the diner. We need to talk." It was unsigned, but John didn't need a signature to know who it was from. Heart pounding, he drove through the quiet streets to Molly's place, nerves twisting in his stomach. The diner looked the same as ever, modest, unassuming, yet filled with a sense of warmth that made his chest ache. He pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly, and there was Mark, sitting at their usual booth, 2 cups of coffee steaming between them. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then, slowly, Mark gestured to the empty seat. "Sit down." John obeyed, sliding into the booth, feeling like a kid being called to the principal's office. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I never wanted it to end up like this." His voice was quiet, almost tired. John swallowed, guilt churning in his gut. "Neither did I," he admitted softly. I'm sorry, Mark. I pushed too hard. I let it become about the money, and I forgot why we started this." Mark nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "You know, I was proud of what we did, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being fun. It stopped being us." He looked up then, meeting John's eyes. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it together, and we need to do it right." Hope flickered to life in John's chest. "What do you mean?" Mark took a deep breath, his expression softening. "I'm saying, let's try again. But this time, no investors, no crazy expansions. Just us. Let's make second chances about second chances again." The relief was overwhelming. John felt something uncoil inside him, a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "I'd like that," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. They sat there for a while, sipping their coffee, the silence between them comfortable once more. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still wounds that needed healing, words that needed to be said, but it was a start, a new beginning, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. After that evening at the diner, things didn't magically go back to the way they were. Mark was cautious, hesitant even, as if he were testing the waters before fully committing again. They took things slow, revisiting the basics of what made second chances special in the first place. The food truck stayed parked for a few days while they worked on repairing not just the business, but their friendship. They spent hours talking, reminiscing, and reflecting on what went wrong. John opened up about his fear of failure, how losing his corporate job had shaken him to the core, making him desperate to prove he could still be successful. Mark listened quietly, occasionally nodding, his face softening with understanding. "I get it, man," he said gently, "but success isn't just about money. It's about being happy with what you're doing." Slowly, they started making changes. They stripped down the menu, keeping only the dishes they truly loved, the ones that made people feel something, like the second chance sliders that had won over so many hearts. They began sourcing ingredients from local farmers, partnering with small businesses, and even started incorporating personal touches into their service, like handwritten notes of encouragement attached to each order. The idea was simple: to remind people that everyone deserves a fresh start, no matter where they come from or how many times they've failed. And in doing so, John felt a shift within himself, a softening of the rigid, success-driven mindset that had governed him for so long. Their first outing after reconciling was a small community event, a farmer's market on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a grand relaunch or a big splashy affair, just a quiet, modest return to the roots of what they'd built. Mark was visibly nervous, his fingers drumming a restless beat against the counter as they set up. "What if no one shows up?" he muttered under his breath. John, standing beside him, glanced over and smiled softly. "Then we'll eat a lot of sliders," he joked, earning a reluctant chuckle from Mark. But as the morning wore on, people began to trickle in, old customers, new faces, even a few familiar ones who had seen their rise and fall from afar. By noon, the line was respectable, stretching just far enough to make Mark relax and flash a genuine smile. They moved in sync, a seamless dance of sizzling burgers and warm greetings, laughter mingling with the aroma of grilling meat. There were no frantic rushes, no pressure to meet quotas or impress investors, just them, doing what they loved, serving food that made people smile. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. And more importantly, they were enjoying themselves again. The joy was back, the sense of camaraderie, the shared pride in creating something together. For the first time in months, John found himself laughing freely, the weight that had been pressing down on his chest lifting with each customer they served. Their renewed sense of purpose didn't go unnoticed. Regulars began returning, not just for the food, but for the story. Two men who had been beaten down by life, only to pick themselves up again, stronger and more united than before. People came to talk, to share their own struggles and triumphs, turning the food truck into a sort of community gathering spot. John and Mark started recognizing faces, remembering names, and even learning bits of their customers' stories. The truck became more than just a business. It became a symbol of resilience and hope, and as word spread, they found themselves getting invitations again, not from investors or big events, but from small local gatherings, charity functions, and community fairs. But while their business was healing, their friendship still bore scars. There were moments when old tensions would flare, like when John pushed for a bigger order, or Mark wanted to spend more time perfecting a dish. Yet, every time they clashed, they managed to pull back before it turned into something worse. It wasn't easy. The wounds were still fresh, the trust still mending, but they kept at it, knowing that this time they couldn't afford to lose sight of what mattered most. "If we're going to do this," Mark would say during late-night discussions over beers and spreadsheets, "we have to keep each other in check. No more going off the rails." And John, to his own surprise, found himself agreeing wholeheartedly. Their turning point came at a local charity event. They'd been invited to serve at a fundraiser for a nearby children's hospital, a cause that hit close to home for Mark, whose younger sister had battled leukemia when they were kids. The turnout was bigger than expected, and as the evening wore on, they found themselves swamped with orders. John felt the familiar buzz of urgency, his old instincts kicking in. "We need to pick up the pace," he muttered, glancing at the long line of waiting customers. Mark shot him a warning look. "Not this time, John. We're doing this right." It was a simple reminder, but it grounded John, pulling him back from the brink of slipping into his old habits. They slowed down, taking the time to chat with each person, sharing stories and laughter, even giving away extra sliders to kids who couldn't afford them. By the end of the night, they hadn't made much money, but the smiles and heartfelt thanks they received were worth more than any paycheck. As they packed up, Mark turned to John, his eyes bright. This is why we started, remember?" John nodded slowly, the realization settling deep in his chest. "Yeah, I remember. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about connection, about making people feel seen, valued, and cared for." From that point on, they stopped chasing after the big gigs and focused on building something meaningful. They partnered with local schools to teach cooking classes, visited shelters to provide free meals, and even started a mentorship program for aspiring young chefs. Every decision was made with intention, guided by a single question: does this bring us closer to why we started? And every time, if the answer was no, they turned it down, no matter how lucrative the offer. It wasn't easy, but it felt right, and slowly, they began to rebuild not just their business, but their reputation, and most importantly, their friendship. By the end of the season, Second Chances was no longer just a food truck. It had become a beacon of hope, a place where people came not just to eat, but to feel uplifted, inspired. They were approached by a local newspaper, then a regional TV station, each wanting to share their story. John hesitated, memories of past ambitions tugging at him, but Mark's steady gaze kept him grounded. "This time, we do it on our terms," he said firmly. And so, they shared their journey, not as a tale of business success, but as a testament to perseverance, friendship, and the courage to start over. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people all over, sharing their own stories of loss and redemption. For John, it was a humbling experience, a reminder that their small venture had touched lives in ways he'd never imagined. One evening, as they closed up shop, John glanced at Mark, a smile tugging at his lips. "We did it, didn't we?" Mark looked around, at the bustling crowd still lingering near their truck, at the smiles and laughter filling the air. Yeah, we did. There was no need for grand declarations or big plans for the future. They were right where they needed to be, doing what they loved. Together, they drove home that night in contented silence, the truck rumbling softly beneath them, and as the headlights cut through the darkness, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. They still had a long road ahead, full of challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid, because no matter what happened, they'd face it together, and that, he realized, was more valuable than any amount of money or success. It was their true second chance. As the seasons changed, so did second chances. What began as a desperate gamble by two old friends had blossomed into something more, a movement that echoed far beyond the confines of their small food truck. John and Mark continued to pour their hearts into every meal, every interaction, and every decision, making sure that their vision stayed true to its roots. They started taking the truck on small road trips, visiting nearby towns and communities that had heard of their story and wanted a taste of what they offered. Each new stop felt like a step forward, not just for the business, but for them as individuals. The truck wasn't just a source of income, it was a symbol of everything they had overcome and all that they had yet to achieve. One of their most memorable stops was in a small, struggling town that had lost most of its businesses in recent years. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of disappointment and loss, the streets lined with empty storefronts and boarded-up shops. John felt a pang of familiarity. He remembered that feeling, the despair of watching something you've worked so hard to build crumble away. But as they set up in the town square and fired up the grill, something amazing happened. People began to gather, curious and hopeful, drawn by the delicious smells and the vibrant red truck that seemed almost out of place in such a somber setting. Mark greeted each person with a smile, his warmth breaking through the gloom like sunlight piercing through clouds. As John flipped burgers and prepped orders, he noticed something shifting around them. The small spark of joy they were creating was spreading. Kids laughed as they received extra fries, parents exchanged smiles over shared plates, and conversations began to bubble up in the line. It was subtle at first, but by the end of the day, the atmosphere had transformed. Where there had been silence and resignation, there was now laughter, chatter, and most importantly, hope. One elderly woman, her eyes misty, approached them as they were packing up. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching John's hand. "It's been so long since I've seen the town like this." That moment stayed with John. It was a reminder of the power they had, not just to serve food, but to uplift, to inspire. From then on, every stop they made was done with purpose. They sought out places that were hurting, communities that needed a little bit of light, and as they gave back, they found themselves receiving something invaluable in return, a deep, abiding sense of fulfillment. Mark, who had once been so hesitant to expand, started talking about new ways they could reach more people. But this time, the focus wasn't on profit or fame. It was on connection, on using their story to help others believe in the possibility of their own second chances. Their journey came full circle one evening when they returned to their hometown for a special event. The local high school was hosting a career night, and they'd been invited to speak, not about food trucks or entrepreneurship, but about resilience. John felt a knot of nervousness in his stomach as he looked out at the sea of young faces staring up at him. He'd given plenty of business presentations in his life, but this was different. This was personal. He glanced at Mark, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, John began to speak, sharing their story, the highs, the lows, the failures, and the lessons learned. As he spoke, he saw something change in the students' expressions. They leaned forward, eyes widening, not at the mention of success or money, but at the parts where they had struggled, where they had almost given up. John realized then that what resonated most wasn't the triumphs, but the willingness to keep going despite the setback. "Life's going to knock you down," he said softly, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But it's not about how many times you fall, it's about getting back up. And sometimes, getting back up means starting over, from scratch. And that's okay, because every time you start over, you're stronger than before." The applause that followed was thunderous, but what touched John the most was the line of students who stayed behind to talk afterward. They shared their own fears, their own dreams, and John and Mark listened, offering words of encouragement and support. By the end of the night, They were exhausted, but elated. "We've come a long way, huh?" Mark murmured as they packed up, his voice thick with emotion. John smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. "Yeah, we have. It wasn't just the truck or the business that had changed. It was them. They had grown, evolved, become better versions of themselves through the process." Back on the road, they continued to spread their message, each town adding a new chapter to their story. They set up scholarship funds, launched cooking workshops for underprivileged youth, and even started a small foundation aimed at helping struggling entrepreneurs get back on their feet. Everywhere they went, they made sure to leave a little bit of second chances behind, whether it was through a shared meal, a kind word, or simply the presence of two men who had dared to believe that starting over was possible. And as they drove from place to place, the bond between them, once strained and fragile, solidified into something unbreakable. Their journey wasn't without challenges, of course. There were days when the truck broke down in the middle of nowhere, when harsh weather ruined their supplies, or when they faced backlash for turning down lucrative offers. But every time doubt crept in, they'd remind each other why they started. "We're not here to build a business," Mark would say quietly, his eyes steady on John's. "We're here to build hope." And those words, simple yet powerful, kept them going through every rough patch, every moment of uncertainty. One day, they found themselves back at that empty lot in their hometown, the place where they'd first launched the food truck. It felt surreal, like coming home after a long, arduous journey. The lot was filled now, bustling with people, friends, family, supporters, even strangers who had heard of their story and wanted to witness it firsthand. As they served the last meal of the day, John looked around, his heart swelling with gratitude. It wasn't the money, the recognition, or even the success that mattered most. It was the journey, the lessons learned, the bonds formed, the lives touched along the way. Standing beside Mark, John took a deep breath, savoring the moment. "We did it, Mark. We really did it." Mark's eyes shone with unshed tears as he nodded slowly. "Yeah, we did." There was no need for more words. They both knew that what they had built together went far beyond a food truck. It was a testament to friendship, resilience, and the power of believing in second chances. And as they packed up for the night, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, just like they always had. Because some things, John realized with a smile, were worth more than all the wealth and success in the world. Have you ever felt like everything you've worked for just slipped through your fingers? Maybe you've experienced a setback that made you question your entire path. What did you do to get back on your feet? Share your story in the comments. Let's create a space where we can inspire each other to keep going, no matter what life throws at us. And what do you think of John and Mark's decision to turn their struggles into something meaningful? Would you have made the same choice, or would you have taken a different route? Let us know your thoughts. Your voice matters. And we'd love to hear what you would do in their shoes. If you've ever thought about giving up on a dream, what was it that kept you holding on? Remember, sometimes the greatest comebacks are born out of the darkest moments. Let's talk about it below. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. Let us know, what does a second chance mean to you? Is it a fresh start, a new opportunity, or something else entirely? I'm curious to see how many different perspectives we have, because sometimes it's the different ways we view setbacks that truly shape our lives. So don't forget to share your thoughts. And remember, if you believe in the power of second chances, hit that like button and pass this story along to someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over. See you in the comments.